I have a reading to share with all of you this morning. The reading I selected for today is from the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew chapter 14, verses 13 through 21. I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version. And this should be a familiar story to many of you. When Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place all by himself. But when the crowds heard, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw that there had gathered a great crowd, and he had deep compassion for them, and he cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to Jesus and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now very late. Send the crowds away so that they might go into the villages and buy food for themselves." And Jesus said to the disciples, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." The disciples replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fishes." And he said, "Bring them here to me." And then he ordered the crowd to sit down on the grass. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, and he blessed and he broke the loaves, and he gave them to the disciples, and then the disciples gave them to the crowds. And they all ate, and they were all filled. And they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, and it was 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, and beside them women and children. This story about the feeding of the 5,000, or actually the feeding of, the approximately 10,000, since apparently the 5,000 does not count the women and the children. The feeding of the 10,000 is a story that is probably well known to most of you. It may be in the top 5 most famous stories from the New Testament. If you went to Sunday school as a child, you probably learned this story. And you've probably heard at least one sermon on this story of the loaves and the fishes and the feeding of the thousands. And I can understand why this is such a popular and well-known story. It has an easy to understand and easy to interpret message. I consulted with my 2 children, my 6-year-old and my 8-year-old, about this story while I was preparing this message for all of you this morning. Here's what my almost 6-year-old told me about the story. She said, "It's about how you should share, and if you share, then God will make enough for everyone." My 8-year-old has clearly spent his entire life as a Quaker, going to Quaker meeting, because he said, "It's a story about a potluck." And he would be right, but it is a story that seems to be about a potluck. And he said, everybody pitched in together, and then there was enough for everyone. Both of my children were correct about the meaning of this story. It's a story that is ultimately about generosity. And whether you believe that the loaves and the fishes, they miraculously multiplied as a miracle that Jesus brought the people that day, or if you believe that it was the divine abundance of a potluck meal, whatever you believe about the loaves and the fishes, it's a story that is very clearly about sharing, about generosity, and the spiritual benefit of being generous. So what does this story mean for us today? Well, people since forever have read into this a message about feeding those who are hungry and being generous in general with our resources. And I think that this is a valuable and needed message today, just as it was thousands of years ago. At its simplest, this is a story about changing our mindset, At the beginning of the story, the disciples have a mindset of scarcity. They say to Jesus, "We do not have enough to feed all of these people." And then by the end of the story, that mindset of scarcity has transformed into a mindset of abundance. The disciples go from fearful hoarding to broad generosity. They go from not having enough to having enough. It's a simple message, but it's one that has profound and broad implications for us today. This passage was on my heart this week while our country brought some of the leaders from some of the largest tech companies in the world before Congress. These people, all men, happen to also be the richest people in the world. The question that Congress posed was whether these companies, because of their size, have become a threat to our economy and to our democracy. I personally felt that this question was answered pretty clearly during the hearing, but I urge all of you to read or watch the coverage for yourself. Whether or not you think that these companies pose a threat to our democracy, they do raise a moral question about how much is too much for an individual to have. There's a question that is raised about the wealth of a very small group of people, or you could say the greed of a very small group of people, and how that impacts a much larger group of people and what they need. One of the world's richest people is the CEO of Amazon, and he was one of the people who testified before Congress. He makes over $2,000 every second of every day. Or, to put that differently, he makes as much as the average American man with a college degree will make in a lifetime. He makes that much money, a lifetime's worth of money, in about 15 minutes. This matters, not so much of because what he has, but because of what most people do not have. The Pew Research Center has done some incredible research about American wealth since the Great Recession. And all of that data from the last 10 plus years shows the same thing. The gap between the richest few and all of the rest of us is growing, and growing quite sharply. We live in a country that exemplifies the opposite of the story of the loaves and fishes. In that story, everyone has enough because all is shared. We live in a world where everyone does not have enough because a very few have most everything. The question is, what is this passage calling us to do? And the answer to that is both personal and also touches on a larger scale. On a personal level, the story is encouraging us to be generous with what we have, with the promise that scarcity can be transformed into abundance. If you have extra clothes, donate them. If you have extra food, you can give some away. As our announcements said this morning, you have an opportunity to give food away this week to help the new arrivals, people who are new to our country. If you have a neighbor who lives close to you, bring them some cookies or a salad or a casserole. If you have a neighbor who is single or living alone, you can bring them a plate of dinner and leave it on their porch. If you have extra time, an abundance of time, You can use some of that by calling someone who might be lonely, or calling a family who has young children who might be struggling during this back to school season. Write a card or a letter to someone who has done something kind for you, or who has in some other way changed your life. If you have too many toys in your house and you feel like you might lose your sanity if you have to pick up all of those toys anymore, not that I'm speaking from personal experience at all with that, but if you have an abundance of toys in your house and you're losing your mind over all those toys, maybe have your children go through them and give some of them away. If you have extra money, and most of us do have extra money. If you have extra money, be generous with that money. Give away a little bit more than you think that you can. Be generous if you can in anonymous ways, so that it is simply about the act of generosity instead of whatever credit you might get for being generous. Pay for some strangers' groceries or gas. Give away money to people who are asking for money on the street corners. Contribute to the GoFundMe campaign for a stranger to help pay for their emergency medical bills. There's lots of those in this country. You can donate to one. Give away some of what you have, trusting in the truth of this story. The truth that abundance can come even from scarcity. The truth that we all have an abundance of something. This is a truth that is very counter to how we have been taught in our consumerist society. Our consumerist society, which has told us that we do not have enough, that scarcity is the truth of our lives. But the truth about our lives is that most of us have enough. Most of us have more than enough and can be generous with what we have. This week, I heard a lovely story about the power of generosity and how giving to one another and caring for one another can change a community. An acquaintance of mine shared that she is part of a neighborhood Facebook group. And a new family had recently moved into her neighborhood. They were not just new to the neighborhood, but they were new to our country. Using Google Translate, they posted to the group and asked for ideas of how they could celebrate their son's birthday. Their son didn't have any friends in the neighborhood yet and couldn't have a party anyway because of the pandemic. The Facebook group leapt into action. They put signs all over the little boy's front yard on his birthday, wishing him a happy birthday. They organized a surprise birthday parade where cars drove by his house with birthday messages for him, signs and banners. They gathered an abundance of birthday presents for him and left them outside on his porch. And they ordered him a birthday cake. That generosity that the neighborhood showed, that act of loving your neighbor, which is literally how we are told to live in the New Testament, that changed not only that family and that neighborhood, but it is in fact changing other communities and other people as well. My friend shared that story with me, and it inspired me to be generous this week. And now I'm sharing that story with all of you. And I hope that it might inspire you to be generous and creative in your generosity in the weeks to come. That generous, loving care that neighborhood in a different part of the country from the one that we live in, that generosity is having a ripple effect, growing greater and greater. It is in that way, I think, that the loaves and the fishes multiply. In the act of generosity, which grows greater and greater as we share it with others. The power of this story is one that does not just reach us on a personal level. It also calls us into action on a broader scale. Although that is not typically how the loaves and fishes story is preached from pulpits in the US, and it's probably not what you were taught that this story meant when you learned it in Sunday school, but there is in fact another message in this passage. One that gets us back to those tech giants who testified before Congress this week. We are a country that has long told the story that hard work should result in higher pay. This is a story that we tell again and again. It is a story that says that the harder you work, the more money you will make, and that the harder you work, the more money you deserve to make, and that eventually every American can buy a yacht. I am here today, the child of working class parents, to tell you that this story is a lie, as most of us know if we were to think about it even a little bit. There is no one who works harder than a construction worker. There is no one who puts in greater effort in their job than a nurse. No one who clocks more working hours than a truck driver or a farmer or an elementary school teacher. These people are not going to own yachts. They are not going to make that kind of money in their lifetime because our system is not set up that way. Our system is not set up to reward harder work with higher pay. This does not even take into account issues of racism in our country. The fact that Black and Indigenous people of color are always going to be at a significant financial disadvantage because of generational wealth and other forms of systemic racism. Women, too, no matter how hard we work, are still going to make less money than our male colleagues doing the same work. In 2017, Christianity Today reported that clergy women with children experience the worst pay gap of any kind of clergy woman. They make 72 cents to the dollar that our male colleagues make. In comparison, in 2020, the average pay gap between men and women is about 81 cents. So clergy women with children are making 72 cents to a dollar, while the national average is 81 cents to the dollar. Additionally, clergy women are 5 times more likely to be hired into part-time positions and are rarely, very rarely, hired as head of staff or senior pastors. And all of this might seem like it has nothing to do with loaves and fishes and feeding thousands of people. But it does. Because our system is one that is not about abundance. Instead, it is a system that drives scarcity. Because a few are set up to succeed and succeed spectacularly, and the rest of us are left trying to share the small amount that is left. If the CEOs of companies were not making millions of dollars every 15 minutes, but instead paid higher wages to all of their employees, That would be a sharing of resources, a sharing of loaves and fishes. And that act of generosity would in fact lead to abundance for all. It would also lead to us living into the vision of a blessed kingdom of heaven, a place where there is plenty for all. And that is the truth. There is enough for all. There is enough for all of us, but not if a few people take most everything. If this sounds a touch political to all of you, it is. It was, in fact, even when Jesus fed those 10,000 people. It was, in fact, so political and so disruptive to the politics of Jesus's day that they crucified him. The spiritual call of this message, the good news in the story of the loaves and the fishes, is good news for the poor. It's good news for the poor. It is good news that we need today in our world that is divided by those few who have most everything and all of the rest of us. It is good news that tells us that we can live in a world of abundance, one where there is enough for everyone. The message of this passage, I think, is clear. For those of us who are Quakers and who are committed to simplicity, and for those of us who are Christian, who are followers of Jesus, it is a spiritual imperative that we strive for a system of economic justice in our country, a system that limits the greed of a few so that the many can thrive. A system that is based off of generosity and equality. So in the weeks to come, I hope you will think of this passage, of those 10,000 people who were fed miraculously from some loaves and some fishes. I hope you will think about this and you will think about how you can be generous in your life with the resources that you have. And I hope you will also think about how you can fight for a country that takes seriously equality and the need that all people have to live and survive and thrive, the need that we have to care for those who do not have food to eat. And I hope that you will go away feeling that you are fed and that you are filled with joy. I hope that your generosity will give you that sense of being filled with joy and being satisfied. And I hope too that your neighbors and those around you, that those affected by the generosity that you bring, that those people too will go away feeling fed and filled with joy. And someday I hope that all of us wake up and find that we are living in a country where everyone is fed. Where everyone is fed and where everyone is filled with joy.